tone.
Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to today's webcast. I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Gus Chikawa. Over to you.
Good afternoon. This is Gus Chikawa, and thank you all for attending today. On today's presentation, I'm going to first cover who we are, and then I'll go through the agenda. So Project Assistant's mission is we deliver the future into the present. We are a project management consultancy and a partner to Microsoft. We work closely with the field offices in the regions of Microsoft, and we provide support to the Microsoft project solution, and we've been doing this for 20 years. So we enable organizations to have their PMO success, and we do that primarily in two ways. We create the structure, the processes, the governance, the technology, which is Microsoft Project, and then also the people skills. We also have a thriving project management staffing practice. So that's who we are. So for today, we're going to talk about challenges and solutions. And so in order to go through the challenges and the solutions, the agenda is to actually go through three different kinds of challenges. We'll talk about business challenges, we'll talk about technology challenges, and we'll talk about specifically planning challenges. We have a sister webinar of this about execution. So today is really about the challenges and how we establish project control by having a good foundation for planning. There will be 2 sessions of demonstration. So I'll go through building a schedule from a planning methodology standpoint, and then we'll demonstrate that in Microsoft Project. And then I'll go back and talk about best practices for resourcing and balancing and leveling, as well as baselining to capture your plan as you are prepared to go into execution. We'll talk a little bit about the process we suggest in terms of changing an organization's approach to planning, assuming that needs to happen. We'll leave about 10 minutes for question and answers. There will be a console. My colleagues today will be answering the questions they can, and the ones that need to come to me for some deeper Microsoft Project expertise or project planning methodology, those questions will come to me at the Q&A section. We'll talk about the survey, and then we'll wrap it up. So from a business challenge standpoint, one of the first things we talk about from a business, like why would a business even care about project management? And you could say deliver on time, on budget, but it's really, well, why do we even care about on time, on budget? So we know what success looks like from a project management definition, but what does it mean to a business? And really, what we're really trying to do when we talk about delivering the future into the present is a reliable set of data to make confident business decisions, right? So, not all projects succeed, not all projects finish with their original budget or their original schedule. So the businesses that are funding our projects need to have the capability to know whether or not this project should continue. And the planning phase is the first opportunity to do that. The other thing we want to talk about is defining the information that's needed to scale the workforce, right? So we'll talk about capacity versus demand, and that's a big challenge. It's one that really gets the attention of the business leaders, primarily because they recognize that when they ask, why do we miss our commitments, oftentimes the answer is that the resources that were scheduled to be available on the project, in fact, are not available. So that's a big deal. The next thing is defining initial expectations, right? So there is a propensity in many organizations that when you put that first plan out, especially the key milestones for the delivery of the value of the project, that those things are somewhat cast in stone. And as good project managers, we want to set the expectation that here's the original plan, but that the original plan doesn't necessarily end up being the final plan. So we have to set those expectations. The next one we talk about is, like, what's the official record for monitoring and controlling the project outcomes? And we'll talk about that as we get to the last part of today's conversation around baselining. And then as well as that, we also want to talk about what are the metrics to decide if we're going to kill a project. You know, projects sometimes have to be canceled. A lot of organizations, when I speak to a group of people in project-based organization, I ask them to raise their hands how many people have a formal cancellation process for their projects, and I've never seen the majority in a response. So we have one of the first things we need to do is have this sort of capability, if you will, to define the metrics to initiate elimination of projects that are no longer viable or not relevant. Maybe their budget's viable, maybe their schedule's viable, but maybe the business case is not. Challenges with planning dimensions. So resource capacity versus demand, that's a big deal. It is on the minds as a number one issue on 80 to 90% of our customers. How do we balance resource capacity versus demand? And it's the holy grail of portfolio and project management, and that's a challenge, right? We need all the data from all the project managers. We need the project managers to have capability in this technology and the tools and the processes to support that, as well as the culture and the governance. So the right level of granularity, how do we get to the right person, to the role, all those things matter. Okay, schedule estimates. A big thing behind this is what's the consistent approach? You know, we have a demand for a resource. How do we know that estimate is even correct? How do we know the schedule is based on reality? How do we even know what reality is? So that's a challenge. There's a sort of an assumption or taking for granted that when we put a number into something like the work field or Microsoft project, that it in fact is credible. So project managers, if you ask them why they haven't baselined, we don't know enough yet. We're trying to predict the future. So those estimates are always challenging, and very similar for the cost, right? How do we get a way to look at the labor and other cost-related items that are going to be driving the budget of the project? Okay, so the other challenge we wanted to talk about. Oops, I'm sorry, I'm skipping around here a little bit. Thank you. That's the one you were telling me, slide 8. Okay, I'm getting signals from my colleague here telling me that we had one slide out of order. So I'm going to skip, I guess, over slide 7, and just going to talk about slide 8 just for a second. And slide 8 is one more set of challenges, which are the technical challenges, and these are important. So when we talk about the technical challenges, we talk about defining an appropriate level of detail to enable effective measurement of progress. How do we know how much, is 800 tasks the right number? Is 5 tasks the right number? Is somewhere in between? So there's usually some technical calculations we can do on the size of a project to come up with those answers. How do we distribute the information? Do they come to me? Do I send it to them? Is it a push or a pull? So that is also potentially a concern. The next one, getting beyond the Gantt chart and understanding the project scheduling engine. The project scheduling engine is sophisticated and has been sophisticated for a long time, and it can do a lot of things, and we have to figure out, and we'll talk about this today in the demo, how do we really get an understanding? How do we reveal what this magical, powerful engine is doing for us under the hood? The next one we talk about is the ongoing effort to ensure plan remain leveled. We can level a plan. We can balance capacity versus demand at the beginning of a project, and sometimes we have more time to do that. But what about the things that happen every week during execution? right? So it's an ongoing planning effort. Planning doesn't end when we baseline the plan. Planning never ends because the plan never stops changing. And then the other one, how do we know the best way to get to the right information? And I'm going to talk a little bit about views, tables, and filters. I'm going to fly through this. If you have an expectation that I'm going to go slow enough to maybe have see every click I'm doing, I'll apologize to you ahead of time. If I did that, we'd probably need 2 or 3 hours. So I'm going to demonstrate capabilities, but not so much that I can demonstrate it to the point where you can capture it. So the best practices and demonstration. So we're going to take 2 parts. Part 1 is going to be the capability for the how we set up the work breakdown structure, and also how we set up building a critical path. Okay, so basically we're going to do the foundation of a schedule, and then I'm going to do a demonstration. So here comes the best practice, and then we'll do a demonstration of that. Then we'll go to part 2. So project planning process. What's the primary goal? What is the main product or outcome of this project? So when we think about the theory of organizing a work breakdown structure from a best practice standpoint, it's called, I call it sweeping verbs into logical piles. What are the actions we take as a project manager and a project team to actually build the outcomes? So we have something we would call an organizing principle. So we need to have some kind of organizing principle. A very common one would be a development methodology, how we design, build, and test, for example. It could be location dependent. It could be team dependent. So there are many different ways we can think of this. So that's one thing we have to be thinking about. What are the sub-goals and intermediate steps or intermediate tasks, if you will, to build the deliverables? What are the key activities? So how do we get, even another layer down? So Microsoft Project will let you indent, which I'll demonstrate, and I'm just using sort of 3 examples here: the organizing principle, or the phases, the major activities, and the tasks. We can go deeper and deeper into that granularity in terms of breaking down the work into packets that are digestible by the team that are working on the tasks. And then in what order do these things have to be sequenced? And that's really the foundation of a schedule. If we understand the constraints on our resources and on the logical movement of task to task to task to build those deliverables, we will be able to render that in the Microsoft Project capability. Okay, so now that we talk about this sort of first part of the planning process, talk a little bit about where does a work breakdown structure come from. So when we talk about the context of portfolio and project management, we oftentimes show this context of the top of the pyramid where we have portfolio management, where we propose, select, measure, and respond to the strategy of delivering the future into the present through a portfolio of the right projects. So we call the top part right projects, and the bottom part we call done right. So if we were to ask if we're executing a project, if I ask a project manager, what is your goal or how would you define success, we would usually hear things like on time, on budget, the bottom right side, which is the business controls, the business management, the project management, that is how we control the schedule and the budget. Then we get to the left side and say, well, besides managing it, what about the outcomes? What about the deliverables? When we deliver this other measurement of success, not only on time, on budget, but what about on spec? And I use that as a catch-all. Some people would say happy customers. They might say within the defined scope. They might say with high quality. And my supposition is if we deliver according to the specification, we will meet those goals around delivering the scope, delivering the quality, and having a customer who's happy. Okay, so we say on time, on budget, on spec. How do I get to on spec? Who's the expert? It's usually not the project manager. Now, if it's a project manager who happens to be a solution architect or a business analyst or a designer or a construction architect, maybe. But typically, we as project managers or the supporters of project managers have this sort of overarching project management methodology. I call it the horizontal, based on this graphic I'm about to show here, where we have these vertical or life cycles, and these are just some examples, right? What is the methodology for building, defining and building consumer products? What about software development? What about architectural engineering design? How about development in life sciences around biopharma and putting new drugs into the marketplace? What about government and aerospace and defense systems where we're building large programs to build defense capabilities or exploring outer space? So these are all capabilities, but at the bottom of this we have deliverables, right? So what's the best practice? The best practice is to understand what are those tasks. What are the tasks that are going to produce the deliverables in the kind of project that I'm managing? So those best practices are really outside of the scope of project management, but certainly the project manager is responsible for bringing the right experts to the table to make these capabilities happen. So when we start connecting these tasks and we schedule these tasks, I'll show a couple of quick examples of some of the dependencies or the links that Microsoft Project does. So the default is a finish to start, which you see the graphic here, with 0 days of lead and lag. How about if I want to have a little scooch in my schedule? How about if I want a little bit of extra time in my schedule? What if I want to do some risk management? So I certainly recommend something like buffering a schedule. There's not a buffer. The question here, is there a buffer for dollars or labor? Well, if you do this in Microsoft Project, nothing is scheduled between these two things, unless you have another task scheduled here. But between these two, there's dead space. We have buffer to the schedule, but this does not create a buffer for labor or for money. There's ways to do that, but this is a great way to put spaces in your schedule. I do it liberally in small packets so that they are not questioned. The other thing, the opposite, introducing risk, is when we're asked to compress a schedule. Can we overlap? Can we start the development work before the designs have been signed off? We can, but there is risk. We increase risk typically when we have what we would call in Microsoft Project a negative lead, or negative lag, I'm sorry. We'll also talk about the critical path, the longest path through the network, or the series of tasks. In this case, we're showing 3 different pathways. The longest path through the network defines the shortest amount of time that the project will take. So that's the best practice to follow critical path theory. It's there. Microsoft Project calculates it. And in this case, if we added up the durations through these 3 paths, we would see the 1, 2, 7, 5, 10 is a 12-day path, and that's the longest path through the network. Okay, so as we follow through that, we would see that that, in fact, is the longest path in the network. And I'll show some examples of how we can explore what that looks like in Microsoft Project. Okay, so we are a little more than 15 minutes in, so I'll just do about maybe 10 or 15 minutes here on the planning. I'm going to start my screen share, and it's going to take a little bit of time to show up on the screen. Are we there yet, Dan? Okay, we're there. Good. Okay, so I'm seeing a buffering. Okay, so this is Microsoft Project. I'm starting with a sample plan. And one of the first things we learn the basics of Microsoft Project. I mean, there is a definition side, right? So if I ask a group of people that are learning Microsoft Project and know something about it, if they're in a blank plan, I say, what is the most common thing you do next? They say, we start typing in tasks. And I say, hold the phone. Wait a minute. Aren't there some things that are, so Microsoft Project has made some assumptions for you, so let's explore them. I start a brand new plan. When will this project start? Well, if I'm planning a project, hopefully not today. If I'm planning today, the project's starting, I don't know, October 1st, November 1st, the 15th of October. So if I go to project information on the project tab, it shows me the start date is the 20th. Well, maybe that's not what I want. Maybe I want this to start in the middle of October on the 16th or the 17th, which is a Monday. We also have a capability to do what we call a default constraint. If I schedule from the finish, some people like that. You see the finish date is gray here. Okay, so if I put tasks in, it's going to finish those tasks once it calculates it, okay? So if we were to put this into a future state, and I start putting some tasks in, we would see this finish date start to change. Well, what happens? So I can't fix the finish date. It's calculated. Gray things in project are calculated, but I can set a start date. Now, what if I schedule from the back? Oh, by the way, it says all tasks begin as soon as possible. That's the default constraint. Project finish date, all tasks begin as late as possible, and if this is supposed to be done on December 31st, I can go ahead and plug that in, and now it calculates my beginning date. And by the way, it doesn't care what today is. So I scheduled backwards from the end of the schedule, and it calculates the start date. And my concern about this is the logic hurts my head, number one, and number two, the start date oftentimes could be before today. So I schedule from the back end of the project, and then it tells me I should have started on Memorial Day back in May, and so we have a problem. And if you're not in the U.S., it's a holiday in May. Okay, so the other thing we want to think about, and I'll show a couple of examples, but what are our options? What options have we shown for how projects are going to behave? Like one example I'll give you. The default for new task is manually scheduled. I don't like it. I suggest changing it. And by the way, if I change this to auto-schedule, I'm not saying you should never use it, but you'll see here, this only applies to this project. So if you're going to change something, we're going to change it to all new projects if we want this to be universal on my instance. Okay? Another one, we'll talk about this a little bit when we assign resources, fixed units, fixed duration, fixed work. Okay, we recommend fixed work. We have a pretty good coverage of this in my book, Project Management Using Microsoft Project. The theory you're seeing today is in there, as well as the best practices, as well as many of the things I'm showing you right now in terms of how we define a project, how we plan, execute, and variance analysis and reporting. The other thing we have to be concerned about is the inventory. What is my inventory of availability for my resources? That inventory is defined by the project calendar. Okay, so if I were to mark out tomorrow is a holiday, because it's a holiday in whatever country you're in, we would skip, a project would skip, the scheduling engine would skip over that date. Okay, so we also need to define not only the project calendars, but also if we went to the resource sheet and we defined a resource, by default, Microsoft Project has assigned me to the standard calendar. That may or may not be what I want. I can create other calendars. I can create different holiday schedules across different countries or different locations within a country. Okay? And I also have the capability to override the company calendar because I'm going to be out on holiday next week. So now if I say change working time, or if I click here, now it says I'm going to give you the calendar for the designer. So I can specify the inventory of availability, not only for the project team, but also the exceptions for the individuals who are working on that project. So that's just a little bit of how we get started here. If I go back, right mouse click on the name of the view, I'd like to use this. It gives me a drop down. I'm going to go to the Gantt chart. Okay, and what I might do is say phase 1, task 1, task 2, and in this case, it did not, I forgot to change to auto scheduled. I would suggest using that. I'm not going to go deep into that today, but I think it's a better default, unless you understand it. So now we have 2 tasks. Let's say they're 3 days each. And a couple of ways I can link these tasks. If I get the 4-directional arrow, my mouse changes from percent to 4-directional to a right arrow. If I go right arrow, I increase duration. If I drag the percent, it puts progress, which I don't want at the moment. And if I use the arrow, I can go back and forth, the 4-directional arrow. Or if I move away from the task, my mouse changes to a link. And there's the link. Okay, now what I suggest doing is being on the view and the details, because in the bottom, it's going to show me if I right mouse click, or if I show different capabilities down here, I can show predecessors and successors. Okay, so task 2 has a successor of 1, task 1 has a successor of 2. How about lag? Well, if I put in, I can double click on this, put a day of lag, and now we have that risk buffer for my task. How about if I'm going to overlap? I can double click on the line, or I can click here down below, 0, -1. Now that's a lead or a negative lag. Now it overlaps. Okay, so we would see that task 1 finishes on the 23rd, and this one starts probably a half day sooner. We're not seeing the times here, but you can see that it's starting on the same day. They're both, this one's finishing at the end of the day, and this is starting at the beginning of the day, is what it's showing us, okay? So if I were to go to the view and see my other open windows, what we would see here, one of my favorite buttons on the View tab, on the Task tab, or ribbon, if you will, is to scroll to Task. And it's not showing, so fortunately it is up here on my toolbar. No, it's not, so I'm just going to scroll to it. My resolution has been restricted, so I have a few less buttons than I usually have. So we see now what happens when we start to link these tasks. We start seeing the effect of project automatically scheduling a task. What if I push this out? Project says I can start this on the 15th based on its predecessor. What if I push it out to the 16th? It lets me do it, but it gives me a warning. As a matter of fact, over here in the indicator column, we have a task is start no earlier than. Okay, what does that mean? That's called a constraint. I'm going to go ahead and double click on this and go to the Advanced tab, and it tells me I put a constraint on here. So we have this capability to constrain the scheduling engine. Project said I can start this sooner on the 15th, but you pushed it out to the 16th, so now I have a constraint. If I hit my little alert here, it tells me entering a start date limits how project can schedule this task, okay? So that's another capability we have when we're scheduling, is understanding how constraints work. We also sometimes recommend showing this as the last task in the critical path. Well, the critical path is the longest path which defines the endpoint, so we must have a task scheduled on 5/1. So if I go down through my schedule, I can see support goes live happens on 5/1. Well, I could put a target end date, and I could link these two. I can click the link up here. That's another way I can do it. Okay, and I can go ahead and scroll out here, and I see I've created a relationship. I could actually say, well, the project actually doesn't need to finish till the 15th, so I'll put it to the 15th, but watch what I do now. I'm going to move it and keep the link. Okay, so now we can see the link. I'm going to double click on this and go out to the Advanced tab and say, finish no later than the 15th, and it's going to warn me. Well, I'm sorry, it will warn me if something goes wrong. Okay, so what happens if my critical path starts to change? How can I see the critical path? Let's go to Format, and we're going to format text styles, and we're going to show, my machine's getting slow for some reason right now, I'm not quite sure. Hopefully it's not about to crash. Okay, it didn't crash, thank you. I'm going to show the type of task is called critical, and the background color is yellow. So there's my critical task. So what happens if I add 12 days? Everything's cool. What about 14 days? That's okay. I added 4 days out of my 5 days of slack. How about 15 days? Okay, still okay. How about 16 days? And then eventually, what's going to happen out here is we're going to get a warning. Where did that go? No later than. It's going to give me a warning that says you're violating the critical path. So let's take a look at what we mean by the critical path. If I applied the table, view, table, schedule, the definition of a critical task is it has no ability to move unless it moves the end date. A critical task, if it's late by 1 day against its original schedule, will push out the project schedule by 1 day. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and delete this task. Go back to the original path we had. Okay, and we can see here this thing called total slack. And you'll notice that any task that's highlighted in yellow, in fact, now the detailed task, not the summaries. The detailed task have 0 days of slack, so they are critical. How about if I look at the Gantt chart? Let's go back here and see that these same tasks also have red bars. Well, how did that happen? There's a format capability that you can check critical, and Project will automatically format the bars so that they look red. If I scroll down here, I would see a definition that Project automatically set up for me that says if a task is critical, show it as red. If you don't want it to be red, you can make it orange, but that's up to you. Okay, so now my critical path is orange. Okay, or purple, or whatever you think is going to get everybody's attention. The other thing we like to show is another view called the network diagram. And by the way, these views are alphabetic by task, alphabetic by resource. Here comes something called the network diagram. And by the way, the slider is awesome. You can zoom in. I'm in the bottom right now. It's taking its time. And I can zoom out. There we go. So the network diagram, in fact, gives me a picture of my critical path. The dotted lines are the 8.5 by 11 portrait pages that would come out if I printed this on a printer. So you need a lot of tape or a plotter to actually print this report out. But we can see how the critical path lays out in the project. So once we have the critical path, now the question is, where do we go from here? We have a critical path, we have a schedule. How do we get the schedule to be realistic? Okay, so for example, if I go back into my slides, I'm going to go back and start talking about part 2. And in part 2, we're going to talk about the rest of the planning process. So we're going to talk about assigning and balancing resources. And we're going to talk about how we level them, two modes, resource management, or resource leveling, and task leveling, and then actually capturing the snapshot, the commitment that we're going to make for how this project is expected to play out. And that's the best practice. I never say this is the schedule. I say the estimated schedule, the estimated labor, the estimated budget. So we're going to talk about what the estimated finish is based on the current baseline. So let's talk a little bit about best practices here, and we'll go back into the demo. So the project scheduling process, when we start talking about resources, we talk about what skills are needed to do the tasks. Are they roles or are they named? Project allows both. In a perfect world, we probably have roles in the templates, and we have probably named resources in the projects. Not always, but sometimes. How about how big are the tasks, right? I alluded to this earlier about how many tasks should I have? What kind of rules of thumb do we have? I hate to see 800 tasks, but there are certain kinds of complex projects that have 800 tasks. So how do we do the right sizing? And there's some rules. The rule of 40 I heard when I was at IBM, professional services, 25 years ago. We tried to get them into weekly packets, if you will. Going deeper than that created a lot of updates. And we were doing it on paper originally, and even that was a little bit easier in some cases than using this technology and seeing how fast it changes everything. When will the work need to be done? So what's the deadline? How do I slot the resources into the right part of the schedule? What if they're not available? So how do we know if they're available? Right? How do we capture the original plan commitment? So these are the questions that we ask about, to define the approach for how we take a date-based schedule into what we used to call an optimized schedule. And the definition of an optimized schedule, the way I learned it when I was a young project manager, is everything that is known is put into a plan that works. And that is tricky when we start bringing resources into the discussion. Okay? When we get to baselining, I'll demonstrate this. Baselining is really copying the current estimate to the baseline estimate. When we see these fields, work, cost, start, finish, duration, in the Microsoft project table I'm about to show, they are, I suggest whispering the two words, current estimate or current plan. Okay, so that's the thing I'm changing all the time when I'm updating my schedule. But the baseline is something we can capture. So when we baseline, we in fact copy the current estimates into the original estimate. And Microsoft Project will leave them alone unless you tell the scheduling engine to change it. So now we have the basis of variance analysis. Is the current plan, the current estimates, varying from the original plan? And the way we get to measure that is by actually taking a baseline. The other thing I'm going to show real quick is how the duration work and units work. There are a couple fields that are tricky. So there's some formulas, there's some examples here where we talk about how the formulas work. And so, for example, when we look at this first example, if a task has 40 hours of work, what's the default? How's Microsoft Project going to schedule this if it is 40 hours and this thing called units, my resources available 50% of the time, I'm going to apply 50% of their effort. It's going to calculate automatically that must be, if I have 8-hour days, that must be a half a day, 4 hours a day, over 40 hours. It's going to calculate the duration, right? So it takes this formula and it says, let me take 2 weeks, which is duration is 2 weeks or 10 days or 80 hours for duration, but the work, which is the 40 hours, is going to be spread over those 10 days. How about if we had to complete a task within 4 weeks and the work was 120 hours? So again, if we divide one over the other, if we take the 4 weeks and divide that, in this case it's going to be how many days? It's going to be 20 days. So if we put 20 into 120, let's see what the math says. The duration, 160. Not 120. So we have 120 hours of effort, okay, and if we divide that into 120 hours of effort, we're going to come out with a units calculation of 75%. Okay, so Project takes care of this automatically, but some people, when we see the work of 160 going into, 120 going into 160, and we see how it schedules that 6 hours a day, is that what we want? Now, by the way, the biggest problem most people have is the default is 100%. So if I put in 5 days and assign a resource, it assigns 40 hours. If I put in 10 days and assign a resource, it puts 80 hours. You go, well, I don't want 80 hours. And I go to the plan, and it's got problems. What do we mean by problems? Well, I'm going to start with the end. I'm going to start with an analysis of, do I have a plan that works? Do I have an optimized plan? So I'm going to go ahead and go back to the Gantt chart. And it should take a second just to pick up. It says it's green, but I'm not seeing it. Are you seeing it? Okay, good. All right. So if I want to see, so one of the things we talk about when we're showing folks, project managers, how to use this scheduling engine, there's really primarily 4 views. We did show the network diagram, and there's a resource graph, which is also powerful. But the most common are the task views, Gantt chart and task usage, and the resource views, which are resource sheet and resource usage. So if I want to see if my resources are, and by the way, we talk usage as seeing things over time, budget over time, labor over time. Okay, typically that's what we're seeing over time. So if I want to see resources over time to see if they're realistic, I'm going to go to resource usage. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and scroll to a spot where my resources are in fact scheduled. I'm going to collapse the detail. This is showing me my resource and its assignments. And there's an awful lot here. Okay, so you can see that there's a lot of data. We could have 10 resources across 100 tasks. Let's say 5 resources per task over 100 tasks. That's 500 assignments spread over 100 days. That's 500 times 100, 50,000 cells of assignment data. So how do we zoom out and see if we've got a realistic plan? So we're going to do a select all, top of the column here. We're going to do a view outline and hide. Hello, that's a filter. Outline, he said. Hide subtasks. I'm going to zoom this out from a daily scale to a monthly scale. And now we see whether this plan is realistic. Or who would you rather not be on this project? And I would say pretty quickly, Steve, who has 428 hours scheduled in March, that's a rough ride. That's 107 hours per week. Okay, so how does this happen? Well, it happens because we schedule people without checking their availability, or maybe we don't know how to check it, or we let Microsoft Project calculate the work, right? So we want to fight that scheduling engine from doing too much without letting me know what's going on. So what I suggest is when we view details, you may recall the default was resources on the left and predecessors on the right. So I'm going to right mouse click in this lower form, go to resources and predecessors, and what I'll see here is by default, my resources in fact are scheduled for 40 hours at 100%. Okay, so, and by the way, the default, I'm going to go back to this other, I'll just show you a quick demo. This designer, we're going to assign to a 4-day task. So I'm just going to hit. Now, by the way, what a lot of folks do is they don't even split the screen, okay? The reason I like to split the screen is if you get lulled into, if you get lulled into like doing something like resource assign, oh, isn't that handy dandy? Wow, let me just assign the designer. Click, assign. Click, assign. Great, got the designer. There's the designer. I move over here to the resource column. Hey, the designer's applied. Awesome. Now look what we have already. We've got 2 little red men out here, and if I wave over this indicator, this task has overallocated resources. Well, good Lord, what happened here? Okay, so if I click here, we will see, I'm going to change the view again, resources and predecessors. My designer went 100% at 32 days, and maybe I didn't want them to do that. Or if I'm using fixed units, if I increase the duration, the work goes automatically to 48 days. 6 days times 8 hours a day. Hey, what if this is 10 days? Whoa, wait a second, what's going on here? Let's put this back to 4 days. I'm going to change this to fixed work. Fixed work, okay. Increase the work, the duration by 8 days. Now spread it out over 8 days. If I put something down on the bottom here called resource usage, what I'll see is that resource, in fact, was scheduled for 4 hours a day. Still overallocated. Gee, what's the problem? Well, I've got 4-hour days on this task, but what about here? What about task number 2? If I scroll over there, I'm going to see that there's this overlap. When we put the overlap on these 2 tasks, we caused an 8-hour day for task 2 and a 4-hour day on task 1. Now we've got a problem. Now, by the way, one thing I recommend is if we were looking just in the resource usage, what I might do is go to the view and zoom this out to a weekly scale. Oh, what's the problem? He can do 32 hours that week. He'll figure out to go home Thursday and come back Friday. Okay? So sometimes we have to know when to ignore the red. Okay? So in this case, 32 hours is realistic, even though there's an overlap on Thursday this week. So when we get into the larger schedules, or the schedules where we have scheduled everything without really checking if people are available, we get into these situations where we say, well, gee, what's the problem with Steve? Well, the problem with Steve is he's got 428 hours, and it's spread across quite a number of tasks here. Okay, so how can we move Steve and make him realistic? And usually what we try to do is look at this as well as the other people who are assigned to these tasks and start to move it. Right now, there is a resource leveling capability. Okay, if I check the leveling options, what Project does by default is uncheck the first box and check the next 2. And if you look at what these things mean, if we ask Project to level this plan, as you may recall, we have a project that's ending on May 9th of 2017. Okay, so if I go back to the resource usage, and I say go ahead and level my resources, I'm going to say level all. Watch what happens over here. So it can't do everything. Sometimes, like, there may be a constraint, for example. Okay, but look what happened. I was going to finish on this. So now my resources are balanced, but at what cost? If I go back to the Gantt chart, we can see that the end date moved from the 7th of May to the 23rd of August. Now, project can only do what it can do, right? It can reschedule you to a place when you're available. It can't cut the scope. It can't bring other people in with similar skills. It can't negotiate with your resource manager to give you the best technologists that you want to have to work on this project. Okay, so there are limitations to what leveling can do. So what we suggest doing is when we're assigning our resources, we have a situational awareness where we're checking that resource usage. As I click here, I can start seeing, now I put the wrong thing, I put resource sheet, resource usage. Now we start to see how these resources are laid out, and if we want, we can go ahead and do that maybe on a monthly scale and start to get a sense of how my resources are scheduled across my project. So that's sort of the balancing and loading part of this. And then finally, when I ask people, okay, let's say this plan is okay now, okay, so it is realistic and I want to take a baseline. When I ask people what happens when you set the baseline, they say, well, what do you see happening? The most common answer I get is nothing. And the reason is there's a view, right? If I right mouse click here, it gives me a list of tables. These are the tables that are in the menu. There's also more tables hidden behind here, and one of them is called the baseline. Let's apply the baseline table. So here's my baseline table, and here's my initiated values. Same thing we saw in the PowerPoint, nothing in there. When I go back to the entry table, we see that things like the start and the finish, and if I even insert a column called work, we can see that the work is still there. Okay? So these values are the current estimates, the current duration, current start, current finish, current work. And if I insert the costs, I don't think I had cost on my resources, but I can change that, right? So I could go to the resource sheet. I could tell it to go ahead and make my standard rate for my resources $100 an hour. And go ahead and drag that down just like Excel lets you do. And go back to the Gantt chart. Now we have some real costs. Right, so now when I baseline, it's going to copy the current duration, the current start, current start, current finish, current work, current cost. All right, so I go to the baseline table, more tables, baseline apply. Let me go a different way. You can also go view tables, more tables, baseline. I know I'm almost done the demo part for my friends who are helping me watch the clock. So when I say project, set baseline, and I can choose select a task, I can do interim plans. I'm not going to go there today. I'm just going to say okay. And we can see now we in fact have a baseline set. And by the way, there's this cool view called the tracking Gantt. And what it does is actually show 2 bars for every task. The gray bar is the baseline, and the red bar is the current plan. So I'm leaking into execution. After you baseline, you may, in fact, change this, for example, from March 6th to March 13. I'm going to say go ahead and move it. And now we can see the separation between the baseline and the current plan. And that's the whole purpose of the baseline. So that concludes our demo part. We'll just go through a couple quick slides here and open up for questions. Let me go to my other computer because this one's not working. Okay. Did you tee me up? Okay, thanks, Dan. So we have our partner solution is really our methodology. When we install Microsoft Project, and by the way, I'm about to give the survey and all those other things that'll get you some prizes hopefully. But anyhow, the Vision, Implement, Adopt, VIA, Vision, Implement, Adopt. So the implementation of Microsoft Project, usually on Project Server on premises or in the cloud, Project Online for Office 365. That's the implement part. But we do a upfront vision, and you see those 4 dimensions there that are the process, the technology, the people, organization, skills, if you will, and the governance. We do a phase up front to get ready for this serious investment and of time and money for an organization, and really lay out how those 4 pieces fit together. So we have I won't go into the details today, but it is a tried and true methodology. As I mentioned earlier today, we've been around for 20 years. We've been working with Microsoft Project, well, actually longer than that, my previous company. And I'm a published author on Microsoft Project. If you go on Amazon, you'll find my book, and you'll be able to find all the things we covered today. Excuse me, if you want to slow it down. So I'm going to thank you for attending our offerings. I just mentioned the ABR, the first step, the vision is the analysis, vision, and roadmap. If you go to our solution page, you can click on this and get more detail. I'm about to show you my contact information. You're welcome to contact me. So we do training programs around risk and requirements management and leadership for project managers and sponsors, as well as Microsoft Project and project management theory. Obviously, Project Server and Project Online deployments, and project staffing if you need project managers to run your projects. So here's some key resources that are available to you from Microsoft around Microsoft Project. So feel free to go find these things. The other thing I wanted to do was open the floor for some questions and answers. And you want to read a couple questions there, Dan?
Yes, feel free to ask questions at this time. We have a few minutes to cover a few of your more specific questions. We did have someone during the presentation ask about, you had referenced a book or a training guide that covers everything in this presentation and much more. I promise you talk a bit about the end about that, so you want to talk about the book? Our training material for many years was a combination of theory, project management theory, as some of the stuff I showed you today, it's all in the book in terms of the methodologies and all that business. But the book itself has sort of interleaved chapters between theory of project management as well as Microsoft Project, hands-on exercises. So it's called Project Management Using Microsoft Project. So if you go on Amazon, you'll be able to find that under my name. You can type in Gus Chikala. I'm about to show that in a minute, the spelling of my name. And so, yeah, if you're trying to access that work, you can find it on Amazon. By the way, it's also been picked up by Kendall Hunt Publishing. So if you want, if you're an instructor or a university professor, this is also in a second edition with a lot more editions of test sheets that can be torn out. We have a full color version of it. So Kendall Hunt, Kendall Hunt, Hunt. If you are interested and you can't find it, I'm about to show my email address. And I don't know who that was who just asked that question, but it was not a planted question for some shameless self-promotion. But thanks for the question. Go ahead, Dan. We have someone asking, is there a way to create a library of templates for work breakdown structures?
There sure is, and boy, you really caught me there. I had a script here, and number 3 of my 14 things, which I skipped, is using templates, also available, Microsoft Project Server and Project Online, and you compel me to go back now to go ahead and show that. I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to just pop into Project real fast. The one thing I meant to do was when I said File New, I do get options, right? So yes, there is a library. If you go through Help on the Microsoft Project site, there are many templates out there. If you have installed Microsoft Project, you can see the templates that actually come in the product. So you can see commercial construction, agile project management, software development, residential construction. There's some really nice dashboards that we cover in the execution part of this webinar, where we cover some of the newer capabilities, even in professional market research. So if So there's really two things. If you're using Project Standard or Project Professional on the desktop, not connected to Project Server or not connected to Project Online, you can access these because they're on your local drive if you install Project. Okay, so if I click on Agile Project Management, yes, it does bring that up, and it asks me for a start date, and when I click Create, it in fact opens that thing and gives me that plan. The thing I'm not demonstrating today is Project Server, but if I was connected, which I'm not, when I do a file save as, one of the capabilities, if I had my connection to the SharePoint Project Server, I would also have the capability, if I'm an administrator, it'll give me a type. It's either going to be a project or a template. So I can, in fact, also upload templates that do not have to be locally installed and will be in the server, and when you start new projects, that library will also show up. So hopefully that answered your question.
All right. We have another question coming in to please compare and contrast the on-premise server and Office 365 versions of Project.
Sure. We have, by the way, on our website, we have an entire webinar we did on the differences between on-prem and in the cloud. So I would invite you to go to projectassistance.com/videos, and you should see something. Certainly the terminology is different. So one of the things we did in that webinar, which is recorded and you can play it on YouTube, is the ability to speak the language, right? So Project Online, what the Project Server are, they're two different things. Oh, Project Server on-premise, Project Online in the cloud. Okay. So we do some of that. We do some pricing, but I presume your question is primarily about the technical differences. And, when we set up on-premise, our customers buy servers, they buy software, they pay us to stand up the servers, oftentimes even with the Windows operating system, server, SQL connected to an existing array of SQL servers. There may be, certainly SharePoint is part of this. So, there's the time for us that you pay us is not significant. It's probably a 2-day effort for a fairly simple environment. But the bigger deal is the upfront investment, right? So you buy the servers, you buy the server software, you buy the desktop software, and you pay for it all up front, right? Now, the other way is a rental model. You could go to MicrosoftOnline.com or SharePoint.com, or go to Google Microsoft, or probably Bing Microsoft, I should say, for a Microsoft audience, and go find the pricing page, and you can literally enter your credit card and have a Project Server instance at your fingertips, and it's actually, I think, up to 8 instances now that you have when you instantiate a Project Server environment. And by the way, we do not suggest you do this on your own. Our service is around how we collect the configuration requirements and actually configure it and load the data and make sure the backups are being done right, and all that sort of learning and experience. We do that. So those two pieces are fairly similar. In terms of our implementation methodology, they're pretty similar, but it's really about the cost model. You'll keep paying for Project Online for a long time, but it'll be in small increments as opposed to an upfront investment. Hopefully that helps. If not, send me an email or check out the webinar we did.
Those are all the questions we have at the time, so that leaves you a couple minutes to cover the survey and the following webcast.
Thank you, Daniel. I will do that. So I promised my contact information, so there's my email address. I mentioned I'm the founder of Project Assistance, and I'm still a relevant project geek, which is why I'm doing this demonstration today. Survey. So if you would please fill out the survey at the end of this event, which is going to happen in T-minus 60 seconds, and enter for a chance to win one of 3 Microsoft Project step-by-step guides, which is our competitor in a wonderful book, and we wrote that for many years before we wrote our own. So very, very good coverage of the topic. We wrote ours because that doesn't cover online, or at least the last time I checked, it doesn't cover online, but very good with the scheduling engine, and certainly would recommend that as well. The upcoming webcast schedule, these are project related. There's a wide array of
webinars available, but the webcast schedule coming up here, you see there's one specifically on effective project management in the manufacturing sector. Project 200, that's not a typo. It doesn't mean it's Project 100 or 101 versus Project 200. So this is a more advanced, fix your project management processes or forget it. And then we have one for the healthcare industry on October 6th, and then the more basic one on the 18th. So I'm going to turn it over. Honestly, I'm going to wrap it up, and thank you so much today for your time and attendance, and hopefully you got something out of this. Have a good day. Thank you.